The deadliest radioactive places on Earth. Part 1.
Nuclear age. Mistakes, accidents, and weapon tests have left behind places too dangerous for people to live in. So for today's video, we're going to take a look at 20 abandoned places that are still radioactive. Starting with number 20, the Hanford site in Washington. The Hanford site in southeastern Washington state, it's one of the most contaminated places in the U.S., and it remains largely abandoned because of the radioactive waste that was left behind. Established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, Hanford was chosen for its isolation, access to water from the Columbia River, and reliable electricity from the Grand Coulee Dam. Its mission was really simple, but it was secret: to produce plutonium for the U.S. nuclear weapons program. The site eventually expanded to cover over 500 square miles, and it housed 9 nuclear reactors, as well as a large processing facility. Plutonium from this location went into the bomb tested at Trinity in July of 1945, and the weapon dropped on Nagasaki, Japan. During the Cold War, Hanford continued producing plutonium at massive scales, which fueled the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. Today, over 50 million gallons of radioactive waste remain in these aging storage tanks, many of which are deteriorating. Cleanup efforts began in 1989, and they continue, making it one of the largest environmental remediation projects ever attempted in the U.S. Entire towns were built to support the facility, like White Bluffs, and Hanford itself was evacuated during the site's construction and never repopulated. The contamination here at Hanford includes plutonium, cesium, strontium, and other isotopes, as well as hazardous chemicals like chromium and carbon tetrachloride. Workers on cleanup projects follow strict safety protocols, and huge areas of the site remain closed. Once a hub of wartime urgency and Cold War secrecy, it is now a restricted zone that's dotted with decaying industrial buildings and waste storage facilities. Number 19. Mayak, the Chelyabinsk region in Russia. Deep in Russia's southern Ural Mountains, the Mayak Production Association, this is a major site of radioactive contamination, was built in the late 1940s as part of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program, and it was designed to produce plutonium on a large scale. Like Hanford, it was a cornerstone of early nuclear development, but secrecy and poor safety practices led to widespread contamination that's still evident today. The most infamous event at Mayak happened in 1957, known as the Kishtim disaster. A cooling system failure in one of the underground waste storage tanks caused a massive explosion, releasing huge amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. It's considered the third worst nuclear accident in history, after Fukushima and Chernobyl. Tens of thousands of people were exposed to radiation, and several villages in the area had to be evacuated permanently. Even before the accident, though, this area has been discharging liquid radioactive waste directly into the Techa River, which local residents relied on for drinking water and fishing. Today, this facility does still operate in some capacity for reprocessing spent nuclear fuel, but much of the surrounding region remains heavily contaminated. The East Ural Radioactive Trace, this is an area of land that stretches hundreds of kilometers, marks the area of fallout from the 1957 disaster. Large sections of this zone are abandoned and uninhabitable due to the contamination of the soil, the vegetation, and the groundwater. While it may not be as internationally well known as Chernobyl, the legacy of Mayak is equally grim. Entire communities were uprooted, and some people were relocated multiple times due to expanding contamination zones. Mayak's story is less about a sudden catastrophe and more about decades of environmental disregard, where the health of the local population was just sacrificed in the pursuit of nuclear development. Number 18. The Bikini Atoll of the Marshall Islands. Bikini Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean, it's one of the most infamous abandoned locations tied to nuclear testing. In 1946, shortly after World War II, the U.S. selected Bikini as the site for Operation Crossroads. This was a series of nuclear weapon tests designed to study the effects of atomic bombs on warships. Over the following 12 years, the U.S. conducted 23 nuclear detonations at Bikini, including tests of both fission and thermonuclear weapons. The most devastating was the 1954 Castle Bravo shot, the first U.S. dry fuel hydrogen bomb. The detonation was way more powerful than predicted, producing 15 megatons of explosive yield, over 1,000 times stronger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion left a mile-wide crater in the atoll's reef, and it spread radioactive fallout over a huge area. Before the test began, the residents of Bikini Atoll, numbering around 167 people, were relocated under promises they could return once the testing was complete. However, radiation levels made resettlement unsafe for decades. Some attempts were made to allow limited return in the 1970s, but those who moved back were later evacuated again after high levels of cesium-137 were found in the local food. Although radiation levels in the air and water have declined, the soil and food chain still has contaminants that make permanent human settlement unsafe. What adds to the legacy of this place is the presence of a ship graveyard beneath the lagoon. Dozens of warships, including the USS Saratoga and the Japanese battleship Nagato, were deliberately sunk during tests, and they now rest on the seafloor. The United Nations declared Bikini Atoll a World Heritage Site in 2010. This place is a reminder of the human and ecological cost of nuclear weapons testing. The islanders remain displaced. They were scattered across other parts of the Marshall Islands, with many still longing for the homeland they can't safely return to. Bikini is then pretty much an abandoned village and an abandoned paradise, one shaped by decisions that were far beyond the control of its original people. The Fukushima Exclusion Zone in Japan. The Fukushima Exclusion Zone in Japan covers a huge area of land surrounding the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. Following severe contamination in 2011, authorities established a no-go zone of about 20 kilometers around the plant, and later adjusting boundaries as monitoring data became available. At its peak, around 150,000 people were evacuated from their towns and villages, and many of those communities remain abandoned today, with empty houses and shops left exactly as they were when residents left. Entire towns like Futaba and Okuma, once home to thousands, are now quiet landscapes of overgrown streets and deteriorating buildings. Public facilities like the train stations and hospitals still are unused, with nature reclaiming the sidewalks and wildlife moving into places once filled with humans. Some areas even resemble ghost towns, with vending machines still in place and children's toys scattered around. Contaminants like cesium-137 and strontium-90 and iodine isotopes were deposited into the soil and the water. Now, while the radiation levels have dropped over the years due to decay and cleanup efforts, certain pockets of high radiation remain contaminated. Large areas of forest and mountains are especially challenging, since removing the contaminated material from these lands is almost impossible. A small number of residents have returned under government programs to allow limited repopulation in certain zones where the radiation levels are lower, and these returnees represent only a fraction of the original people. Yet many others have settled permanently in new areas, hesitant to come back due to concerns over food safety and long-term health risks. The exclusion zone today, though, is both a research site and a reminder of the long-lived nature of radioactive contamination. Photographers and journalists document the stillness of abandoned streets and the slow decay of modern infrastructure. For Japan, the exclusion zone is a physical mark on the landscape, one that shows how quickly entire towns can be emptied and how difficult it is to undo the effects of radioactive contamination once it spreads. Number 16. The Semipalatinsk Test Site in Kazakhstan. On the steppes of northeastern Kazakhstan is the Semipalatinsk Test Site. It's also known as the Polygon. This was the primary nuclear testing ground of the Soviet Union from 1949 until 1989, making it one of the most heavily irradiated abandoned regions. It covers about 18,000 square kilometers, and it was the site of over 450 nuclear tests, including both atmospheric and underground detonations. The first Soviet atomic bomb was detonated here in 1949, marking the beginning of the arms race with the United States. The early tests, those conducted above ground, spread radioactive fallout across huge areas, which exposed local populations without their knowledge or consent. When the testing finally ceased in 1989, the Semipalatinsk region was left with widespread radioactive contamination. Soil and groundwater contain long-lived isotopes like cesium-137 and plutonium, which remain hazardous to both human and ecological health. The Soviet government originally kept the full scale of contamination secret. Of course it did. But after Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991, more information came to light. health studies showed increased rates of cancer, birth defects, and other illnesses among people living near the site. Unlike some abandoned radioactive zones that were cleared in a single event, the Semipalatinsk legacy is one of long-term exposure and gradual recognition of harm. Today the area is largely empty, with guard posts, bunkers, and observation towers. Some limited scientific work continues with researchers studying effects and contamination strategies. This test site has since become emblematic of the environmental costs of nuclear weapons testing. Villages on the periphery still exist, but within the test zone itself, abandoned structures and radioactive landscapes remain untouched. While it no longer serves its original purpose, it's a monument to the nuclear age, one where radioactive contamination continues to dictate where people can and cannot live.